Welcome, everybody. My name is Ethan Roland Soloviev. You've made it to the session on regenerative enterprise and the 8 forms of capital. My co-presenter, Gregory Landway, is not able to be here today, but he sends his regards and excitement for the regenerative enterprises that you are all going to create. So thank you for coming. I work with Terra Genesis International, which you'll hear plenty more about. You can follow us on Twitter and online and all that good stuff. So that's me. Who's here? Let me get a show of hands. How many folks here are permaculturalists? Okay, quite a few. That's nice. How about who here, just so we get a sense of it, would say that they are an entrepreneur? Awesome. Great. Welcome. How many folks here are farmers? Great, thank you. How many folks would consider themselves executives? Executives of companies. Great, thank you, welcome. How about investors? A few investors here, great. And how about, what else we got here? Who's employee of a company that's bigger than one person? You, okay, bigger than 10 people? Bigger than 100? Okay, cool, great, good to know. Thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to introduce some frameworks to work with, and a good bit of this is you're going to work with each other, probably just with your neighbor right next to you, to actually be concretely applying what I'm presenting to your life situation and business, ideally. So I'm here as part of an intersection of 3 organizations. One of them, as I mentioned, is Terra Genesis International, which works to regenerate global supply and global supply chains, which you'll hear lots more about. I'm also an associate of the Carol Sanford Institute. And the Carol Sanford Institute has 40 years of experience in corporate engagement focused on regeneration. And if you think about that, that's actually about the same time or even a little longer than permaculture has been around. So right now there's a bit of a convergence of the realms of permaculture and regeneration, and most people in permaculture don't actually know the lineage of regeneration and the depth and complexity that it has. So one piece of my purpose here is to up the level of conversation around regeneration and what it is, what it means, and how to apply it. Also I'm part here as the Regenerative Enterprise Institute, which is an organization that's coming together to store the intellectual capital commons around regeneration, and especially around regenerative enterprise, regenerative supply, regenerative business. So, Terra Genesis International has a modest goal for the next 10 years. That goal is to work with 100 enterprises to shift $1 billion of purchasing power per year into fully regenerative permaculture supply sources. If we do that right, according to our calculations, that'll shift approximately 100 million acres of land into fully regenerative agriculture. And if that captures all the carbon that I know you all know how to make it do, that would be enough, ideally, to reverse climate change. So, a small goal. I might need some help, and that's part of what this workshop is about. Specifically, Terra Genesis has honed in. We've been around for 5 years. We've done some large-scale international landscape design, 300-acre sand mine restoration in Barbados, permaculture education center in Thailand. We've noticed that just doing the landscape design itself isn't quite enough of a leverage point for us. And so we've shifted to working with enterprises, with companies, with governments. We haven't yet, but we'd be up for it. So our focus is on companies with global supply chains. And I'm putting that in quotes for a reason that you'll understand a little later. Companies that have in their portfolio of supply anywhere from 1 to 1,000 materials. You could go bigger than that too. Raw agricultural materials from multiple different climates, from the tropics, from the cold temperate, from the Mediterranean, from the desert. We're also interested in mineral and synthetic materials. Anselm and I were talking about that earlier. What would regenerative mining look like? Right? How many people here have a computer or a smartphone? Put your hands up. Okay, so you too should be interested in the question of what does regenerative mining look like? How could that even exist? In order to work with an enterprise, we require someone in the C-level suite, the corporate executives, or at least somebody at the business unit level. That's somebody who has a bottom line, has a profit and loss statement that they manage. We need someone at that level, otherwise there won't be enough buy-in, there won't be enough excitement, and the work can't really move forward. So we work with companies that have that level of interest in, not in regeneration, not in permaculture, but in effective, profitable, and resilient operations of their company. We don't necessarily need people who are into green or into quote-unquote sustainability. Often CSR departments, corporate sustainability and responsibility is this like separate department, is this other thing that's not integrated into the business. I don't need to sell to those people. I don't need to work with them. What we need is people who are interested in effective, profitable, and resilient operations, because if you actually head towards a regenerative enterprise, these things start to improve in the business, is what I found in my last couple of years working with this, and what the Carol Sanford Institute has found over 40 years working with companies. When she goes in and Carol Sanford starts working on regeneration, profits increase to 25 to 60% per year over a string of years. So just as a little selection of some of our clients who we're working with, Etsy.com is the online marketplace, global business. They have a new foundation that's working on regenerative business education. We're working on them. Lush Cosmetics, who many of you heard from Simon Constantine yesterday. We're working with the North American company of Lush Cosmetics, but also with Lush UK. And then Chalaka, and we'll talk about both of these in more detail, which is a chocolate drink manufacturer. Why do we work on enterprise? I do not necessarily think that financial capital should be the dominant force that controls how everything happens in the world, but it is currently, is my belief. And therefore, if I want to find an acupuncture point where I can put a little bit of energy and shift the whole flow in the system, I need to go to what's currently moving and dominating and shifting the world. And that is financial capital, and that is business. And therefore, I choose to work on enterprises as opposed to on landscape, as opposed to on education, because I think it's a systemic spot where we can use some really high quality systems thinking and regenerative thinking to shift a lot very quickly. Much like Jeff was talking about this morning, going around teaching a 30-person PDC here and there, that's great. But when I started working with Lush Cosmetics and the CEO said, "Can you train all 4,000 of our employees in permaculture this year?" I said, "Yeah, sure, let's do it, let's go." And it's done, it's like that. Right? So there's a significant leverage in working with enterprises that have the financial capital resources to make things move. And that's where I choose to work there. For you, I would like you to choose an enterprise that you're going to work with for the remainder of this session. So I want you to first think to yourself of an enterprise that you are personally influential in. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to be the executive, but some enterprise that you actually have some personal control over or influence in. And if a couple are popping up for you, choose the one that has the greatest influence in the world. Okay, so everybody think about that for a second. Enterprise, what's the etymology of enterprise? Yeah, what's that mean?
It means to undertake something.
To undertake something, to take something on. So essentially, I define an enterprise as an undertaking, a project that has, usually actually the definition says, an undertaking that is, basically it says something like it has a challenge that must be overcome. So we use enterprise because it's inclusive of business, of NGOs, of little charities, of many different things can be considered an enterprise. And we're especially interested in larger scale enterprises that are companies and corporations for our work, but this works for any enterprise. Okay, turn to your neighbor and just confirm with them that you have an enterprise that you are going to think about, that you're personally influential in, and just tell them and we'll come back. Nice job. That was a very quick quiet down, which we're going to need if we're going to get through everything. So, nice job. Everybody got an enterprise? All right. So, the first framework I want to share with you today is called the Regenerative Continuum. It is a very basic two-term framework that we use to think about and just get people to understand, just to start to think about the concept of regeneration. In this continuum, we've got degenerative on one side. That's destructive, extractive, decreasing the overall potential and possibility of whatever it is you're looking at. On the far end is regenerative. Regenerative is growing and increasing the overall potential and possibility of the situation. It's repairing, healing, restoring, and improving, and going beyond what was already done. So if you have a continuum that looks like this, where does sustainability fall? Somewhere más o menos, more or less, in the middle here. And yet, sustainability is put out as this big goal all over the place right now. I don't think sustainability is enough. What is it we're going to sustain right now? Is it climate chaos? Peak oil? Mass extinction of species? Is that what we're sustaining? Right? Regenerative asks us to go beyond. It's a little bit like Zen and the art of archery. If you're aiming for the target, you won't actually hit the bullseye. You have to aim at a spot 300 yards through the target but beyond it. And you might get there on the way. Right? So we aim and ask our clients and everyone we work with to step beyond sustainability and actually think about what would it be like to regenerate this whole system. Frameworks are incredibly valuable for evolving our thinking. Jeff talked this morning about the current crisis, the current challenge is an opportunity for us to evolve as humans. If we're going to do that, it means we have to change our minds and how they work. And I've found that frameworks are a great way to do that. A framework is very different than a model. Everybody's talking about model. We've got to build a replicable model. Right? That's from a machine paradigm where you're creating replicable little parts that all look the same. This is not a model. Models don't come from whole living systems. Frameworks are lenses through which to look. They're ways to look through and understand the world that have the capability to push and evolve and shift your thinking. One framework that I've found really core to all my work on enterprise is this one called the 8 Forms of Capital. I'll lay it out briefly. It's the main subject of a book I wrote 2 years ago called Regenerative Enterprise, which you can get online for free or you can pay something for it if you want. You can get it digitally or a hard copy, whatever you like, regenterprise.com. 8 Forms of Capital comes from noticing that there is one form of capital that the current world runs on. It's financial capital. This is money. Right? However, there are other forms of capital that are in effect, that are acting, that are shifting, changing, transacting at all times. And if our map is solely based on financial capital and a single bottom line, we're not going to be taking into account the complexity of the whole living systems in which we exist. This map helps to see more. Along with financial capital, there's also material capital. That's this desk here. It's my computer. It's the clothes we're wearing. It's timber, stone, steel, non-living physical things that can be complexed into infrastructural capital, like this building we're sitting in, or a car, or a bridge. Financial capital and material capital are a significant part of the current global economy. There's also, somewhat well known, as social capital. Social capital is influence and connections between people. Right? Social capital, you can often buy social capital with financial capital. And social capital can also be transformed into financial capital if you know the right people. All of these miss and live out what I believe is the foundational form of capital on the planet, which we call living capital instead of natural capital. Living capital is the soil, it's the carbon, it's the water, it's the organisms, it's the genetic diversity in your herd or on your farm. This living capital in the current system is extracted, compacted, destroyed to transform into ever-growing amounts of financial and material capital. This current trend has to shift. 2 other forms of capital that are useful to think about are intellectual and experiential capital. Now, they're different. Intellectual capital is knowledge, ideas, it's explicit information. You're getting intellectual capital when I speak. When you read a book, I read a book once on straw bale building, so I know how to build a straw bale house now, right? No, not at all. Right? I have some intellectual capital, I have some ideas, but I have zero experiential capital in how to actually do it. Great teachers can transform experiential capital, embodied wisdom and know-how, into intellectual capital and share it explicitly. And then, if everything goes well, you then have the opportunity to ground that intellectual capital into your experience and make it real for you. There are other maps of capital, but they usually, and some of them have some of these pieces, but they usually leave out these last 2. One of them is spiritual capital. And spiritual capital has many different forms for every different being. Some religious traditions have explicit understandings of spiritual capital. Buddhism has karma, which is a form of spiritual capital that you can actually develop over lifetimes. Some other communities, like the Tzuti Maya in Guatemala, or in what we now call Guatemala, have a sense of spiritual debt. that is a debt to reality that we each incur coming in, and they spend much of their lives creating beauty in order to repay the debt to the world. Spiritual capital, in whatever form it is, for some people it's faith and prayer, I believe exists and is useful to name. All of these are forms of capital that one can develop on your own, more or less, but this last one is something that actually has to be held by a group of people, and we call that cultural capital. Cultural capital is the ability of a community to step into shared ceremony together. It's the shared songs, the stories, the myths, the food, the language that holds a community and culture together. Living, cultural, social, and spiritual capital are what we call the 4 nurture capitals. These are the 4 that are generally destroyed, extracted, in order to create ever-growing amounts of financial and material capital, using intellectual and experiential capital to facilitate the transfer. One of the principles we write about in our book is you have to shift that fundamental flow and reinvest financial capital into living capital. That's not surprising to you as permaculturists. However, putting it in a language that includes the word capital, which anybody in the business world understands and has a connection with, makes it so that this is available, digestible. It's a conversation starter. That's part of why it's formulated this way. So the work of a regenerative enterprise is to ongoingly develop the quality, especially, and somewhat the quantity of multiple forms of capital. I want to optimize for multi-capital abundance. And I want to just ground that sort of theoretical overview of a framework with an example from one of our clients, which is Lush Cosmetics. And then we'll have you work on your own enterprise through it. So Lush Cosmetics, a fresh handmade cosmetics company, started here in the UK, but now has branches in, it's not quite a branch, sister companies in North America, Australia, and Japan. I know North America best because we work directly with them, with their global buying team and their Sustainable Lush Fund team. They have over 4,000 employees in North America, 220 stores. They're a very, very interesting company, amazing company. They do no paid advertising or marketing. They don't have any middle management. And they're wildly successful. They never discount their stuff. And they believe in some really incredible things. They use fresh ingredients. Going into their factories is kind of like going into a kitchen, right? You've got the little immersion blender at home that you blend up a soup or something with. They have those too. They're a little bit bigger, but it's still one person blending up fresh mango pulp and blueberries and cocoa butter to make a face mask that you put on. But when you get it in the store, it has a shelf life of 28 days. Right? So they actually believe in creating fresh, handmade ingredients. They have a huge charitable givings program. They have a really strong vegetarian vegan stance that I don't always agree with, but I understand is a huge part of the meaning and story of the company. They don't package any of their stuff. A lot of their stuff comes naked. So it's a very fascinating company to work with. Their global supply chain stretches around the entire world and has over 500 ingredients. Probably more, I actually don't know the number, but probably over $50 million in purchasing power every year. That's for the ingredients that they buy to make into their products to then sell.
50 million?
Don't quote me on that. I don't know exactly. A lot. In the millions, many millions range. They came to us and said, would it be possible for us to purchase all of our ingredients from permaculture farms around the world? Can you help us do that? And we said, yeah. Sure. We can help you do that. But there's not enough permaculture farms in the world producing enough to get even a tiny portion of what you currently use. So if you really want to have that happen, we can help you make it happen. You'll need to invest. You'll need to invest into the base of productive capacity in a permaculture scenario. So I work on something that Simon spoke to yesterday that was really crafted by Simon and Paolo and many of the folks at the Lush UK team, and then came to North America about 2 years ago. Sustainable Lush Fund takes a percentage of their purchasing budget, of that however many million it is, and invests it in through grants, loans, and actual investments into 4 main areas of environmental, it should really be eco-social regeneration, food security and sovereignty, enterprise financial viability, and supply chain development. And they do that across 4 climate zones. And there's just some sample ingredients here to get you a sense of the types of materials that they're purchasing in each of these climate zones. You can write these down if you want to. There's also, I'll show you a link where you can get an even bigger list than this. So we've roughly divided things up into Mediterranean, desert, temperate, and tropics. And there's some ingredients here that we call keystone ingredients: almonds, jojoba, honey, and cocoa butter. And that was some of the work that we did in the first year working with them. Was finding, understanding, and investing into ecosystems of enterprises around each of these individual ingredients in different places. So we're working in California on almonds, in Arizona and Mexico on jojoba, in Canada on honey because it's so heavy. We're working right close to the factories to support the sustainable and regenerative beekeeping right around the factories to get all the honey production. And then cocoa butter through cacao starting in Ecuador. Here's a map of the global projects that the Sustainable Lush Fund has funded. So you can see it's quite a global reach. I think it's over 50 projects in probably over 30 countries at this point, and growing more every year. And part of the thinking and part of what happens in the Sustainable Lush Fund is that they invest multiple forms of capital. It's not just financial capital. Terra Genesis comes and brings significant intellectual and experiential capital in permaculture and design that will work with local partners to create in the different places. So just as an example of that, here's some design work for Ecuador around living terraces, diversifying and improving the water holding capacity of some of the cacao landscapes in northwestern Ecuador. This is a design by somebody on our team that's looking at creating these living terraces. So we'll do this process. We fund project partners on the ground, so there's actually local people working on things, and then give them technical support, financial support, entrepreneurial support to carry out really excellent projects. So in northwestern Ecuador at a place called Caimito, and if you want to know more about this project, this is Luke Smith, who works with Terra Genesis, who has lived for many years on the ground in Caimito, where this project is that I'm talking about. And he has lots more details than I do about cacao polycultures and the ecosystems there and the community there. So if you have more questions about that, talk to him afterwards. Thanks. Part of the project here is working with a community work party called a Minga, which is where a whole group of people come together and work on one person's farm for a day a week, and then they move to another farm, and then they move to another farm. So it'll take a whole week per month in some places and go from farm to farm with a whole bunch of communal energy. So Lush has supported the meeting of these Mingas in order to take some of these ideas and beautiful pictures and actually transform them into real living terraces that will then be interplanted with a diversity of fruit trees and heritage cacao varieties from this place. The overall work here is actually heading towards developing a regenerative supply of cacao that is grown in a permaculture way, but then can actually be purchased in 20 metric ton container loads from the second level cooperative and shipped and used in Lush products. And that's starting to happen already. One of the other ways that the Sustainable Lush Fund works is through these seed grants. This is a smaller basically, it's like spreading little seeds. It stands for Sustainable Enterprise Ecology Development, and these are small $5,000 grants. We did 10 projects last year. We may do something similar in this next year. There was supposed to be a sign-up sheet at the back of the room. If anybody's interested in getting grants like these or hearing about the opportunities when they come up from Lush or other of our similar clients in the future, if someone sends around a sign-up sheet, then I'll make sure you get the email for you or any projects you're associated with. This is a quick application, it's a quick bit of money, and part of it is getting to know people, getting to know projects, and seeing if they're a fit for the larger investments and the larger, longer-term projects like the one in Ecuador. Okay, so there's a little grounded example of how one company is working with multiple forms of capital, not just financial, but also intellectual, experiential, and social capital. And if you haven't noticed, Lush Cosmetics is here at this event funding the permaculture research initiative, and they're here growing social capital in the permaculture community. So they're consciously working with multiple forms of capital in the design and development of a global enterprise that is profitable and doing some pretty incredible work. So now it's time to go back to you. I want you to think about your particular enterprise that you thought of at the beginning and apply some piece of the 8 forms of capital framework to that enterprise and say, if I were to start thinking about my enterprise through the lens of the 8 forms of capital, how would it shift? What would change? So let's go on to some characteristics of enterprises. I want to head towards regenerative enterprises, but here's 6 characteristics of many enterprises over here and a few enterprises over here that are heading in this way. So many enterprises have supply chains, right? And they're thinking about themselves as a single entity, a single enterprise out there competing. A few enterprises are starting to realize, wow, chains don't exist in nature. If we're going to mimic natural systems, there are no chains, there are webs. So let's go to supply webs and thinking about systems of enterprises, interconnected organisms working together. A few enterprises are heading that way. Many enterprises have a financial capital bottom line. We call it monocapital. It's a financial capital bottom line, that's it. Some companies are trying to go to the triple bottom line. And that's a great direction in some ways. However, it's still the bottom line, so it's still the last thing you look at. And it's really hard. Triple bottom line companies are hard to create profit in 3 forms of capital, not let alone 8. Many enterprises have either an ignorance of their place or where they are, or even a contempt of it, a destruction of it. And some enterprises are heading towards actually understanding their place and getting a place-based sense of where we are and actually designing either their food production or some of the ways they work based on the place they're in. That's a good direction. Ignorance is like a company that doesn't even know where they are, doesn't know the people where they are, and are just, so for example, land grabbing in Africa is a significant ignorance of the people and ecosystems of the place, coming in, destroying what was there, displacing people, and growing food that shouldn't be grown there to be shipped to somewhere else. A place-based would say, oh, wow, this is interesting. There are some people who have been here before. There are some food-growing systems that have worked here in the past. How can we maybe learn from that a little bit? Many companies, many enterprises are growth at all costs. Some other companies are a little more responsive. They're starting to think in terms of triple bottom lines. They want growth, but they don't want growth that destroys things. Financial capital bottom line means we have to make a profit in money. And that's what the shareholders want to see, and everything we do is decisions towards making excess money. That's it. Triple bottom line, how does it go? I don't even think about everyone. People, profit, and planet, social, environmental, and cultural, different things. I use a different framework. I don't like triple bottom line because it's still the last thing people think about. This needs to be integrated from the top, not at the bottom. Many enterprises either accept or have a real pride of extraction and destruction, ignoring and erasing the history of their company or of their place, like just greenwashing the hell out of it. BP's got a new green thing going, right? Their logo's really green.
Great.
It's awesome, right? A few enterprises are heading towards brand sustainability and corporate social responsibility, which are steps. There are a few more and more people who do this. There's a whole report about the top 100 sustainable companies in the world. Has anybody seen that? It's by the Knight Group. Very interesting. I think number 1's Coca-Cola. Number 2 is GlaxoSmithKline or Pfizer. They're sustainable because they're planning to sustain themselves forever, which is not how natural systems work. Nothing lives forever in natural systems. Enterprises die in natural systems. We should design our enterprises to die and compost and feed the rest of the ecosystem. Many enterprises, in terms of sort of messaging or branding, do a sort of a dictation of meaninglessness, is what I call it, causing a homogeneity and disempowerment of people. Some head towards this kind of message co-creation where it's very feedback-oriented, understanding, hearing, and moving towards human customer imperatives, what the people want and what the people think is important for them. Feedback, lots of feedback. Nothing here, in my assessment, gets us close to a regenerative enterprise. Okay. So now I want to lay out with those there, add a little bit of what I believe would take us towards being a regenerative enterprise. So as opposed to supply chains and supply webs, regenerative enterprise move towards producer webs where not is it just everything's trying to supply a company, but every enterprise in the whole ecosystem is producing value in multiple forms of capital for every other player in the ecosystem. Multi-enterprise reciprocal ecosystems, not systems, which are again from the mechanical paradigm that looks as humans as computers and everything as machines, but from an ecosystem perspective where there's a reciprocal relationship being developed amongst enterprises. Regenerative enterprises aim for 8 capital optimization. That doesn't mean that every enterprise has to create all 8 forms of capital. It does mean that every enterprise has to think of itself and design itself in an ecosystem where different players in the ecosystem are optimizing for certain forms of capital and transacting and exchanging between them so that across the whole ecosystem, all 8 forms of capital are developed. Instead of place-based, it's actually something that's called place-sourced. So it's not just looking at what's there now in the place, but it's going through a full, long story of place process as is laid out by the Regenesis group, which if you don't know them, definitely check out their stuff, to understand the essence of the place. And not just simply paying lip service to it, but sourcing the strategy of the company, the leadership of the company, and the operations from the essence of the place. Instead of growth at all costs or responsive growth, regenerative enterprises would aim for evolutionary growth from designed disturbances, purposefully stepping into disruptive situations, and then grasping that as an opportunity for evolutionary development of the company. The first speaker yesterday talked about Earth going through these periods of massive disruption and instability before evolving, or as part of evolving. I think there's something very similar to that here. Rather than having a brand that's somehow based on sustainability or some idea of green, just like understanding the essence of a place, enterprises that can understand their own essence, their own unique singularity, and regenerate their work in the world from that uniqueness on an ongoing basis, that's regeneration. And then finally, rather than dictating meaninglessness, a regenerative enterprise would head towards actually generating meaning and regenerating the meaning with everybody involved, customers included, towards not human imperatives of what people want, but towards global imperatives. What does the earth want? A fully regenerative enterprise, which I haven't seen any of, would literally not just do work in their space, but would transform the industry that they're part of and change the course of history. All of my thinking here is sourced from Carol Sanford and her work for 40 years in regeneration, and that's part of why the copyright's here, to protect the integrity of her intellectual lineage. These are not easy things to do, and they require shifting and pushing our minds to do them. So what I'm going to do is give a brief example. This is another one of our clients called Chalaka. They're based in the United States. They're a chocolate drink company. They're not a regenerative enterprise. We've told them in working with them that they won't become a regenerative enterprise for many years, because it takes a good bit of time for the thinking of the people and the ecosystems to develop where regeneration on all 6 of those characteristics could actually happen. But they're starting and they're moving towards it. Chalaka uses cacao. How does the cacao get from the farmer to Chalaka? This is how it usually works. First, it goes to a commercial cacao buyer who puts it in a cacao warehouse, who sells it to a commodities broker on the commodities market. That commodities broker sells it to another commodities broker, and often several more commodities brokers, before it finally gets to a cocoa processor, who processes it and then sells it to Chalaka. Okay, that's the standard supply chain. So if we're going from chain to something else, what if we facilitate and resource the cacao farmer to connect with a cacao cooperative, which then has a direct trade agreement with the company? That's nice. More value can go back to the farmer and the cooperative and doesn't get stuck in all the middle people who are here. Right? So that's chained to something different. But what if we actually went to a web? What if, along with Chalaka looked for, and we're working with Chalaka to do this now, other purchasers a local processor, another chocolate maker, a local market, other companies, and supported those companies to buy significant amounts of cacao from the cooperative. It could even then, if the cooperative wanted, sell the commercial cacao buyer. Maybe relationships could even be made with the cacao farmer right to that buyer. It's not cutting them out, but it's changing the flow of the system. Even better, what if there are multiple cacao co-ops, either in the same place or in different places, and along with those different co-ops, Chelaka was purchasing from them, but also supporting them to make connections to other purchasers. Now we're starting to get more of a web. Right? Then, if Chelaka begins to invest into the cooperative, sending forms of capital back, and invest there into the cacao farmer, what would happen? So we're heading towards working with Chelaka to invest into value-adding infrastructure at origin with the co-op, so that the value can be retained and maintained and developed at the origin, as opposed to in a warehouse in the Netherlands, which is a lot of where cacao processing is. Actually, anyone know what room we're in?
Elizabeth Fry.
Anybody know anything about Elizabeth Fry?
Chocolate.
It's very strange, but the Fry family was one of the original importers of cacao, part of the whole system. I think it's very funny. So Chelaka, they haven't yet, but are planning to invest in the infrastructure, building structures like this, which is a value-adding cacao dryer and roaster, I believe. You were there working on this, which is right in the center of town. Which is a simple structure. It's a rocket stove that's in here that could be used for more advanced value-added processing at the origin. This is like right in the town. The ocean's right over there. This is right where the cacao is grown. So if that sort of investment happens from Chelaka, that would be great. But what if also other forms of investment start to happen from some of these other players into that cooperative and other cooperatives? What if, even better, the commercial cacao buyer got the scent of something good, a good story, and decided that they were going to start investing in the cooperative and the farmer and the local processors in the local market? Now we're starting to head towards a regenerative producer world. And this hasn't happened yet, but this is not based on the existence of what is now and the problems of doing that. This is based on the potential of where we could head. So I just talked about how Chelaka is aiming towards some of these characteristics of regenerative enterprises, with the producer webs, building multi-enterprise reciprocal ecosystems, and thinking about optimizing for different forms of capital in different places. I would like you to again turn to your neighbor and think about, maybe just choose one of them, the one you understand the most or the least, and say, what would happen if I sought to move my enterprise toward the direction of these characteristics? Please turn to a neighbor one more time, briefly, and I would like you to name one small, specific, achievable action that you might take arising from the thinking and work that we've done in this workshop. One small, achievable action. I humbly request that you don't run out there after an hour and a half talk and go tell everyone you have a regenerative enterprise. It takes time and attention, and it takes actually shifting the way our mind works. And if everybody goes out there and says it, it'll be very quickly to be greenwashed. And so I invite you to explore the resources I'm going to give you in a minute and start on a path towards figuring out what a regenerative enterprise is. But I don't want it to be a flash in the pot. And my experience is it's taken me 3 years working intensively, 20 days, full days a year with somebody who's been doing regeneration for 40 years to get my mind even to the point where I'm starting to move towards and being able to share it like this. And it doesn't happen quickly, in my experience. It may be different for you, but my invitation is slow and steady. Let's move towards it quietly until we're actually really clear and we can all look at each other and hear the stories of our enterprises and be like, whoa, yeah, there it is. Because, if all the evidence in the world isn't enough, and if political will isn't changing, I believe what actually will shift things is when we can walk up to people who have successful financial capital businesses in the current world and say, so do I. And it produces living, cultural, social, spiritual capital in the midst of an ecosystem. And you can show them your books from the accountant, from your multi-capital accountant, that's got your financial capital bottom line along with the others, and people from the business world can see and respect what we're doing and say, wow, okay, that's interesting. Because that's how the change will happen. That's how, in my experience, people in the financial capital and business world will shift if they can look at your balance sheet and see the reality, not just the big word of we're doing regenerative, but actually show me the evidence. So that's an invitation to you to let's move towards this together, but don't go so fast and hot. That's my conclusion. Here's some resources. Regenerative Enterprise, Gregory Landaway, another guy, university graduate, and I wrote this book 2 years ago. That's version 1.0. We're working on 2.0. Regenterprise.com, you can download the book as a gift for free, or you can give a gift of financial capital in exchange. We're on Twitter. Terra Genesis International does speaking and custom education, whether it's basic permaculture training for your business or a corporation you know that might be interested. We do trainings on regenerative supply and on the creation of regenerative enterprise ecosystems. One-off events don't work. If you're shifting the structure of people's minds, it takes a commitment over time. So we're less interested in coming and doing a 2-day training somewhere because it's not enough. We are interested in exploring multi-year engagements at strategic locations with enterprises engaged to move us all towards regenerative enterprise. If you have a company, an enterprise, and would like to join the first 100 that we're working with in the next 10 years to shift $1 billion of purchasing power into regenerative supply, we're busy. But you can get to us starting in November this year. Europe, North and South America, and Asia are easy. If it's in other places in the world, talk to us and we can see what we can do. Terra Genesis has offices around the world. And there's the contact info at terragenesis.com and on Twitter at @TerraGenesis. Thank you very much for coming, and come talk to me afterwards if you want to chat.